Okay, we are here with Brooke Wentz, who is a fascinating woman, a woman I know for a long time, an old friend of mine, who wrote this fantastic book called Transfigured New York. And it's all about the experimental music scene, artists and musicians. Really, in New York, the sweet spot is the 80s to 1990. In addition to this, I know Brooke as she is a music supervisor for film. She's actually now a film producer. And her real business at this point is she does a lot of licensing of world music, which is featured through a company called Seven Seas Music, which is featured in a lot of the films and television shows you probably have seen. So let's just start. Welcome, Brooke. You're coming in from San Francisco there, Santa Cruz. Where are you?
Yeah, Bay Area. I'm actually physically in Santa Cruz area, but I am born and raised San Franciscan and lived there for a very long time.
Right.
hmm
So actually, that's in Music City. So let's really just start at the beginning. When did you become interested in music? What kind of music and how has it evolved?
Well, as my intro discusses, I grew up in San Francisco listening to rock and roll through my headphones, raised on radio, FM radio, and more of the West Coast rock and roll long form songs. My dad would send me to the symphony every week, so I could hear that. But jazz was not in my blood. However, when I moved to the East Coast, I found colleagues in college who uh, were always curious as to my West Coast
Mhm.
music interests and comparing them to East Coast because there were few people such as a Bruce Springsteen or
Yeah. Who's
Yorma
the
Kakona I had never heard of. And so that was simply because of the area. And even, we'd heard of Todd Rundgren, but Todd was a little more only through the music on the radio. But anyway, so I got involved in radio, and when I came to New York, I started doing a radio show at the college that I went to, and which is part of Columbia University. And I didn't realize I had been forewarned that they are a heavy, hardcore jazz
right?
station, not fusion, but straight up jazz, and that the hosts were tremendously knowledgeable. And I thought, well, where am I going to fit in? Because I don't know much about jazz. And so I did find someone, however, who did a late night show called Transfigured Night, and it played a little more fringy,
Mhm.
avant-garde, stretching the name. And I was like, I know about The Residents and
Mhm.
Tuxedo Moon
Mhm.
and Kraftwerk and some crazy artists like, Schoenberg, actually had
Mhm.
known about through my classical roots, or even Wagner, although they weren't playing
So
Wagner at that
so
time.
so
But
tell me.
anyway, that's how I got involved.
So did you, let's just backtrack a little bit. Did you see a lot of music growing up in San Francisco or, you were growing up in the more like the
Well,
70s, right?
well, yeah, I was growing up in the 70s, but the only thing I was too young to go to the Fillmore, and because remember drinking age was 21 also at that time.
Right.
But I would go to something called Day on the Greens, and
Mhm.
that was Peter Frampton, Fleetwood Mac, Santana, Robin Trower, Dave Mason, that type of vibe. So
Mhm.
that's the only music I could see live. And my parents would literally drop me off there by myself in Oakland and go. But there was no, I mean, I do recall one time possibly seeing Janis Joplin with my father at one
Mhm.
point.
Or look alike.
But yeah, or someone like, I just remember he was always really into whatever was going over on at the Haight-Ashbury. So
Mhm.
he would kind of pick up that. And mom came home once and told me that there was this musician who she didn't really know him, but he played guitar and did things, and his name was Carlos Santana. And I'm like, Mom. And I had to take her to like Tower Records and show her all the records that he did.
Right. Yeah.
Um, he had married a woman named Debbie Santana at the time,
Right.
and her father, Saunders King,
Right.
was my mom's patient. My mom was a physician,
Oh.
so Saunders King and Debbie were clients or patients of my mother. So when Debbie started dating Carlos, that's how Carlos came to the office. But
That,
anyway, I mean, we were just surrounded, but no, there, you didn't have like outside lands and all the venues. Live music wasn't quite as happening as it is
yeah.
today.
Well,
So,
we had, in terms of doctors, we have a guy, I actually did a story on him. It was about all the rock stars who came up here and started other businesses or other, like Melissa
mhm,
Oftumar from Hull started Basilica Hudson. This one guy up here, his name is Bruce J. Milner, and he's the town dentist, and he's worked on everybody from Sonny Rollins to, everybody who lives in the Woodstock area.
yeah.
Kate Pearson, and he was in a band. He was in a pop band in the 60s, a one-hit wonder band that did a song called Come On Down to My Boat Baby, which I'm sure you remember. So, medicine and music are connected. So let's get back to WKCR. A fantastic station, still a great station. You're talking about the authorities who were on it. I used to
Mhm,
listen every morning when I was driving my car to the station to Phil Shapp and That was with
mhm,
Bird Flight. So,
mhm.
all right. So you get there, you're at Columbia University, and you get this late night show. And really, that is the book is actually transcriptions of some of those interviews, which you did because COVID was here and it gave you the opportunity to transcribe this. So let's talk about, when did you start the show? How often did you do it? And what are maybe some of your more memorable early episodes? And
Oh, I've had some great times up there. I mean, I started in 1980-ish, and I continued to show till 1988 when I started traveling and someone else had to take over my show. Um, and
you weren't in college for 8 years, were you?
No, I was
Okay.
an
This
undergrad,
is
and then I took some time off. I was
Yeah.
working in music, essentially in
Mhm.
Manhattan, but I was able to maintain my show, and then it moved from the 1 to 5 a.m. slot on Thursday nights to afternoon music, which was I think 3 to 5 or
Mhm.
to 6. And that was in the last few years. But then I went to grad school, so I was able to maintain it during grad school. Um,
And
I mean,
what did you study? I'm sorry. What was
well,
it?
I was going to do biology and kind of follow my mom's footsteps, but my biology class was at 8:30 in the morning on Fridays, and I had my 1 to 5 a.m. radio slot. So my 8:30 bio class didn't really work out so well.
Oh,
I was surrounded by some very studious students, and I was half asleep in my
yeah.
class. So for one semester, but I ultimately picked up art history because I'd sort of been pushed in that direction with through a professor and told it would be good for me, which I'm thrilled. And I almost did go to grad school for art history, but I decided not to. Um, but the 1 to 5 a.m. slot was open, and I did that, and I thought this is crazy. But then you might be, I mean, if you're a New Yorker, you'd be surprised. There are lots of people who are up, lots of students, lots of cab drivers, lots of just generally anyone. And so a lot
Musicians
musicians,
coming home from
yeah.
gigs.
And I would even have friends that would drive down from, New England, and they would hear this, pick up the show like in Westchester, and they'd be able to hear it all the way driving in, and then sometimes stop by this station and hang out with me at 2 in the morning. Um,
Well, before
but
we get into that, let's talk about New York in the 80s, like the club scene.
mm,
What were and I'm assuming that as a part of your job and your education, you're in music, you went out a lot and you went to a lot of these places and you saw the musicians. So tell us a little bit about the clubs in the 80s and what the scene was like and how that sort
mhm.
of went into your show.
Okay. Well, honestly, I got to New York a little sooner than I anticipated. I wanted to come after college, but I got there during college. And when I was there, my attitude was, wow, I'm here in New York. I'm not just going to stay uptown and be stuck in this college. I'm going out. So I would always get on the 1 train and go downtown. And um, working at the radio station allowed me to get free tickets to go to shows. So I first started going to, I think it was Haraz. It was on the Upper West Side
Hmm.
a lot. And I remember going there even on weekdays, and the place might be empty, but there would be a band like the Bush Tetras that I'd want to go see. And then Danceteria was open, and we go there, and there was always shows happening there. A what is it? A two A,
Oh,
I don't
two
know.
A.
Once
Yeah,
A
two A
10
was the
or
get. Was that the gas station place? Two A.
yeah, there was one,
That
but
was
there was
a place in
down
the
in the
gas station.
Lower East Side. I mean, the kitchen, of course, I would go there a
Right.
lot. Just because those were the things we were promoting. Then you had Phil Schaap's Experimental Music Foundation. You had Roulette, which was right down on West Broadway. You
Knitting
had
factory. Knitting factory.
yeah, oh yeah, definitely a knitting factory. That opened up later though. On
Mhm.
Houston Street was the original one. And
Right.
what was interesting was I would stop after going out, I would need to take the one train back up, and I would go because WKCR had such a reputation with jazz clubs. I would go to Sweet Basil because I could get in and sit at the bar, and I
Mhm.
would meet there. I think it was the guy's name was Joe or Jimmy, was so nice at the bar there. So I could get a drink and hang out and see whoever was there. And it was usually like Sun Ross Orchestra was here, or you'd have other musicians who would be, leaving their gigs and hanging out before, because Sweet Basil's was right by the one train. So you could get it and go
Right.
back home.
As was
Um,
Seventh Avenue South around at that time. It was more of a fusion
I
joint.
don't remember one. That was a little
Yeah.
later. Blue Note
Yeah.
was not really as active. Most
No, it
people were
was.
going to Village Vanguard, but it was a little bit too highbrow for me at the time. And also I wasn't a jazz head. Like jazz to me was such a foreign type of music. I absorbed it through osmosis, just working at the radio station and walking in and seeing people like Don Cherry sitting there, or Andrew Cyrille sitting there,
Mhm.
or I don't know, Sonny Rollins. They had all these really famous musicians, the jazz musicians
Mhm.
there. Um, but anyway, so New York was filled with many different. Oh, and then you had the Bleecker Bobs, and they would have like record stores, and the record stores down on the in Greenwich Village and on 8th Street on the Lower East Side were always filled
So
with
was the show from the jump, was it really about interviews, or was it about more about
Mm-mm.
playing music? And who were some of the folks who got you started? Who were some of the early interviews that are memorable to you from the show?
Well, my very first one scared the Jesus out of me. The first interview I had to do was with Philip Glass to promote his music in 12 parts at
Oh
Town Hall.
boy.
And I had to call my friend Tom in Boston and ask him what I should ask. And I remember I was so freaked out. I remember the payphone I called him from on 110th Street and started writing, taking notes. And then Phil came up to the station, and we had to put him in a room and tape him because that was a taped one,
Mhm.
because they really just wanted people to come to a show. So it
Right.
was really about promoting a show. And that interview is actually in the book, but that was, I interviewed him. I was literally like 17 years old interviewing him. I
Right.
was petrified. And then what you would do is you would tape it on reel to reel, and then you'd have to go into the editing room and cut it up and put leader in between each one of the things. And then you would take that reel to reel and play it during your time slot.
Well, you
And then
also
mix
you
it with
also
music of the artist.
so
So
you
that's what.
also interviewed Lamont Young, John
Hmm.
Cage,
Hmm.
Lucas Foss, a bunch of that
Bunch
ilk.
of those people. Yeah. And a
Uh,
lot of like the younger people, like the Elliot Sharps and the John Zorns and the Christian Marclays and I mean, what's his name? Like, yeah, well, not Andrew Cyrille, but like, Bill Frisell and Ronald Shannon Jackson, all those people, they would come up at 1 in the morning, and they would
right.
be my guest live on the thing. Now, we don't have an interview in the book with Elliot Sharp or Christian Markley, but they both came up numerous times. Even Christian was doing like spinning turntables at the time. Eric Bogosian, who's also in the book, he
Yeah.
came up to promote his show, and
Which
because he's
show
an
was
actor,
which
he was
show
doing
was
like
that?
talk
Talk.
radio. It was his
Oh,
solo shows. He came up
Edmund
twice.
Lane or
Yeah,
what?
I can't remember where it
Yeah.
was, but actually, I think there's a picture in the book of one
Yes.
of the playbills.
Right.
But those people were great because audio wise, I mean, remember it's radio, so you only want to. It's about audio and how it sounds. So
Right.
you want, and a matter of fact, in doing this book, I reached out to Peter Gordon who's
Hmm.
had his Love of Life Orchestra for a quote. And he's like, well, Brooke, we also did an interview. And literally the next day, he sent me an interview I did with Arthur Russell. And honestly, I didn't even remember doing that
Wow.
interview. So I was like, oh my God, I forgot.
So these
So,
were what were the? How did you have these? You had these on cassette, or you had them on? Were they
well,
digitized, or
some
put
were
the
on
three of
reel
them
to
on?
reel and some were on cassette. The ones on reel to reel I had previously digitized because I knew that those type of tapes would deteriorate quick.
Mhm.
And then I mean, I was just cleaning up the basement during COVID because what else are you going to do? You got to clean up your house, and, or people might have cleaned up their house more than once.
Right.
Um, I found these cassettes and I thought, holy geez, I've got to get these digitized. Like the
Right.
more I let them sit in my basement, the worse it's going to get, and pretty soon you're not going to be able to even hear them because cassettes melt.
You
So
yeah.
I got them digitized.
You also said something about New York as a pass through for many musicians. So, what do you mean by that? You would mention that when we were talking.
Well, New York at that time in the 80s, you have to remember that, and this was brought to my attention by doing some of these interviews, that New York for creatives was a very creative place.
Hmm.
LA certainly was not at that time. I mean, maybe within its certain, like, a certain genre of music, but New York for the more art, audio kind of crossover, contemporary music composer type um, was very much New York centric. And even more so because in the 80s, remember the Berlin Wall hadn't come down yet. And
Hmm.
so Berlin was not, there were a lot of artists that would go between Berlin and New York, but it was all on the west. And they did a lot. There was also Amsterdam was a big hub. Paris was a big hub with IRCOM. Amsterdam had, I forgot the name of the place there, but there a lot of the more experimental and new music composers were kind of doing that European circuit.
Yeah.
You couldn't go to Hungary, you couldn't go to Prague, you couldn't go to Germany, you weren't going over to the East. Japan was too far.
Yeah. Well, I was
There
just
were very,
yeah, I
you
was just
know,
yeah. I just played a show. I just opened for Gary Lucas, who was up
oh
here.
yeah.
And Gary is like an example of that kind of musician, the Knitting Factory, those European tours that they would, and he told me, personally for a long time, that's how we kind of made ends meet going to Europe, that the market was better. And this is probably after the 80s and 90s, but the market did kind of costs got more expensive for musicians here. There were less of these kind of experimental, let's call them, clubs open. So people did have to find, a way to make ends meet. And again, Europe was certainly a route that they took. Now, one of my favorite parts of the book is you have a lot of interviews with guitar players. And some of my favorite guitar players. You obviously have Bill Frisell, you have Vernon Reid, but you have Glenn Branca.
Glenn Branca.
Do you have I actually did one of those Reese Chatham orchestra gigs. I did played with him at Lincoln Center. Did you have him in the book or just Glenn?
No, I didn't have him in the book because the thing is the book is, even though I've interviewed Reese a few times,
Yeah.
and he was one of the first interviews I did to get a quote, was that these were all interviews that were on tape.
Oh,
So
right.
I didn't tape every show I
Right.
did, just taped here and there. And there's no way for me to transcribe an interview that didn't, I mean, I've interviewed him, but if we don't have it archived, it's not, that's why I was saying even with Elliott Sharp and
Right.
and Markley and Reese Chatham, and I could probably name 20 other artists that,
Well,
I am.
you do have an interview with one of my favorite guitarists who you are somehow connected to, who's also in Europe now, John Paul Borelli. So I mean, I love Borelli. I used to love going to see him at these little, we call them crap holes because I'm on the radio here, downtown. And your former husband and the father of your daughter play with him, correct?
That's right. That's right. And matter of fact, I just saw JP. Probably. I took him, I think we went to Hardly Strictly Bluegrass together in October because he's teaching out here at Davis. But
Oh, he
yeah,
is.
no,
I thought he was in Germany. He's not in
no,
Germany.
he left Germany
Oh, wow.
after his wife passed,
Right.
unfortunately, and he now lives in, I believe, in Virginia, Washington D.C. area, but has taken a job teaching at Davis. So he's out in California.
So
But yeah,
tell people who don't know about him why he and that band is the best thing since Jimi Hendrix, in my
because
opinion.
his sound is very similar to Jimmy's, and it's very but JP has got a real blues
Hmm.
bass, and he also brings in sort of the Caribbean flavor into his
Totally.
music
Like a
because of
Sonny
his
Rollins.
background.
Yeah.
Yes, and yet he's played with so many different players that his knowledge about music is quite expansive and broad, and so he can bring in all those influences. Plus then he has a voice on top of it,
Right.
so and it's really quite bluesy and groove based, and
Right.
everybody likes a good groove. And I just, yeah, he's kind of the whole package for that. And
Yeah.
actually, interesting enough, he was one of the early musicians who got signed to a major record
Hmm.
deal
An
after, I
enemy?
believe, after A Living Color had, but JP actually turned it down.
Oh.
So it was an interesting twist
Well, I know
that
he was on
he was
any
very strong about and really stayed true to his
right.
independent roots.
Well,
So.
I know he had that album on Enemy, which seemed like the sort of not that he was ever commercial or non-commercial or whatever, but it just seemed more like in that rock pocket. Whereas
Mhm.
I've been familiar with his work since then. He's those African albums he did
Huh?
my favorite, one of my favorite albums is Rock the Cathartic Spirit, which I think I'm going to play a little bit of that on this, which
Good.
and so your ex-husband was one of the drummers in that band, and your daughter is now in New York, like you were, and she's working in media and also DJing at night. So you also
Hmm.
had Kelvin Bell in there, who was great.
Hmm.
And then again, Branca, for maybe give people here a little bit of background on Glenn Branca and what sprang from him, his innovations, such as
Well, Glenn unfortunately passed at a earlier age, but he was sort of the wall of sound. Essentially, he played crazy loud guitar but what was interesting wasn't just him. He would bring in multiple guitarists, and Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth was one of the members of it. And many other guitar players. I think
right,
Reese was part of it too, Reese
right,
Chatham. And he would make this orchestra of guitar players and play. And what was interesting is Glenn is because it was symphonic, it was kind of orchestral, but he would never play at like Avery Fisher Hall, and yet it was almost too big to play at the kitchen.
right.
So he sort of this in between. But I think Brooklyn Academy of Music, when that opened up in the 80's, by the
Mhm.
way, they featured him in a tremendous turnout for his performance because they had a bigger proscenium stage to accommodate a good orchestra,
Mm.
or a full size orchestra. And but he was very much about overtones. And what's also interesting is Glenn worked with Lamont and
Mhm.
dealing with tuning the guitar, so he was very interested in that.
Yeah.
I maybe probably through Reese Chatham, who did the tuning. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
getting it
Well,
confused.
yeah. I'm just
Reese
gonna,
was part of the tuner of
I
that,
was gonna
but I
stop you there.
think
There's
that I am
little bit.
sure that that melded over into working with Glenn and dealing with that.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, but comparing the two guys, I saw Glenn twice. I saw him once, pretty close to the end of his life. He played at La Poisson Rouge, which was a
oh,
very stripped down band. I saw
wow.
him before that. I think it was the summer before the World Trade Center fell. He played outside there. He maybe had 100
Ooh,
guitarists. And then as I was telling you earlier, I had the pleasure
he
of
had 100 guitarists.
he had
Did
100
he?
guitarists. When I played with
Oh my
Reese
God.
at on the album Live at Lincoln Center, there were 200 guitarists, and I think there were 50 bassists. And then we got rained out the first year, and then we came back and did it the second year. And
Oh
then
wow.
the day before the performance, he brought in a guy to play the hi hat, just to keep everybody together because it's like 200 guitars. But the thing is, they were both used very unusual tunings. The tuning to my guitar was they gave me a gauge, they gave a special gauge of strings. Every string was tuned to E. So
Oh wow.
it was really a matter of counting, because what they would have is certain sections would be playing like just a chord on the 13th beat, and then the other section is playing on the 7th beat. So it's really like very much of an exercise in mathematics, and not actually listen to what goes on around you. But I was very happy. I was very happy to see a lot of guitarists in here. We did talk about Bogosian, was there anyone else within there who maybe was not per se a musician? Eric really isn't. He's a monologue. He was at that time a monologuist, a playwright.
Yeah, no, the Bill T. Jones is a choreographer.
Right?
And well, Margaret Langton is not a composer, but she's a pianist who interpreted John Cage's material. Uh,
She used to live across the street from me in Brooklyn. I
oh,
was
really?
like
She's a lovely,
right
lovely.
across the street, and she was the queen of the toy piano for a while there, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
She still
this is
is.
very much
And
known.
I mean,
So so
yeah, that's
what what happened to the scene? What happened in 1990 when you kind of went through this decade? How did it change, and how did it maybe dissipate in a way?
well, that started going in the 90s, started going into the era of more the record labels were getting more interested. There were more areas for their music to be heard. You
Hmm.
started literally getting into the Napster area, although that's a little later in the 90s, which means you're moving into a digital form. In the 90s, I mean, I was playing actual vinyl records all the way up through 1990.
Hmm.
And therefore, things were starting to become CDs. So you started having people purchase CDs. When CDs were being made, you also had more of a possibility of plagiarism. And
Right.
so because people could digitally download these songs and then pass them on through their computers to people.
Hmm.
So that became more of an issue. I mean, if you're talking about the music business at that
Hmm.
time, Living Color was got lots of press because they were one of the earlier black rock and roll bands, besides maybe Bad Brains, that was
Hmm.
happening and signed to a major label, Columbia or Warner Brothers or whatever. And so, but music, it just in general was changing. It was starting to be harder. You started having more hip hop. Hip hop was starting to really come out at that
Hmm.
time. I mean, honestly, I was in the recording studio when they were doing Fear of a Black Planet
Hmm.
as an intern. And that was, I remember at Green Street Recording Studio, they were
Hmm.
like, oh, yeah, this is the new music. And I was like, really? This is going to be okay. And that Fear of a Black Planet was after Run DMC's record.
Right.
So there was a lot of things that were starting up at that time. I mean, the music just sort of shifted um, for pop music started going more
Yeah. And a lot of these
just different.
a lot of these artists, they didn't sell a lot of records even when records were being
No,
bought. So it
no.
was
John Cage, Lamont Young still don't sell a lot of
well,
records.
the interesting thing is, as in my guise now as a music reporter and writer, I find out these things about, obscure artists and the sampling and, how they get rich. Like Roy Ayers recently died, and
Yeah,
passed away.
yeah.
And, you know, a lot of these folks, they made more from, a 6 second sample than they did, for making 30 albums from Lunar Records or whatever.
Mhm.
So, what artists that you interviewed that maybe are being a little bit lost to time that you think you hope people rediscover from this era? Who's are the artists that, let's say, 3 artists that you really think deserve a little bit more attention from?
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, one of my favorite ones is Michael Weisfish, who's the last one, and
Mhm.
he really was really before his time. If he was alive today, he would, I'll tell you, he'd probably be up there working at Apple. I
Mm.
mean, David Behrman also was working with Apple at the time. David Behrman is tremendously prolific and a very interesting man, and has influenced a lot of people and he played with John Cage for a long time. And people may not know who he is.
Mm.
But he's made a terrific contribution. Let's see, who else would I say? I mean, a lot of these are pretty well known. I mean, Fred Frith is like super creative, speaking of guitar players, and he still remains. I've listened to the BBC
Mhm.
streaming, and they give him accolades, so that's very nice. Although he's still, he's a little bit on the fringe, just like Evan Parker are. I mean,
Right.
if you're a real guitar player, you will know these people, but if
Right.
not, it's not like you can recall what's their favorite record.
What about you did interview John Zorn, correct? Did you interview
Yeah, but
John?
he's not in the book.
Right. But he's kind of had an interesting
Oh,
reemergence
yes, yes.
as a
And he was also an early one who got one of those MacArthur grants, which we were all kind of like, what?
right. Yeah.
We were just happy to know that that institution would give accolades to someone as fringy as he was.
Well,
And
again, this is a really fantastic book if you want to have a time capsule of a very creative era in New York where there was a lot of music going on, there were a lot of clubs, and there weren't as many hedge fund people driving up the price of rent. But let's just shift gears now. We want to talk about your career. So you have actually a fascinating job that I'm sure a lot of people are envious of. And you tell me the sort of the timeline of it, but I know you from a company where you did music supervision for film and then licensing. And so tell us a little bit about how you got into that business and where it's going now.
Well, that's interesting because it actually kind of does go back to these radio days. So when after I traveled and when I came back, a filmmaker asked me to put music together for this 30-minute documentary that he did about it was shot in time-lapse photography of a building, a parking lot that was being converted into a building. And he just documented how it was being built. And at that time, there was no text. It was just interesting music, and he listened to my radio show and he liked it, and we were able to get, I don't know, 12 or 13 pieces of music for $100 each at that time. And that was my first foray into helping with that. And then I ended up doing compilation albums for a company in Long Island, and one of them sold so well,
That was
it won a
Koch.
bill.
That was
It was
Koch.
no,
Koch.
no, no. It
Oh, sorry.
was Ellipsis Arts, which
Oh,
is no longer in existence, and we did global meditation. And actually, my colleagues, one of my colleagues gave me, a mouthful because of the name of it. But I was like, we had Glenn Velez in there. We had just anything that was. It didn't really have to be meditative music. I mean, we probably had one or two pieces from in this book of. I mean, you could have even a Bill Frisell piece in
mhm.
there, but Anyway, that compilation sold very well. We won awards with and a lot of critical acclaim, and I went on to do another one on celebratory music, and then one on African music, and then one on Indigenous people. So
Mhm.
with all this experience of licensing for compilations, I then was informed about a position at ESPN, which is in Connecticut, as they needed a music director, and my focus was really then more on the business side,
Mhm.
which it still remains to be. And so I went up there and was music director for a while in the 90s, essentially getting their more their administrative and their background of for being litigious, making sure
Mhm.
everything was all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed. But we worked with hiring composers, we worked with production music houses, we did the X Games and had to work with record labels to get music for that. So it was a lot of pairing of music, like some artists are athletes or they wish they were athletes, like Sammy Hagar is a huge mountain biking
Mhm.
fan, so we would get that, or that guy, I mean, we had did a lot with Darius Rucker from Hootie and the Blowfish, and some bands like Train and whatnot want to do things. So they all like doing things when it crosses over to sports. So I did that for a while, and then I left to be a music director at the Times Square Millennial Celebration, where I then went back to my roots of world music and found music from each time zone for their
Hmm.
presentation. And I used that as a launching pad to move my our family back to California.
Mhm.
And then when I was there, I just started doing what I knew best, which is music supervision and clearance. And I started doing it for a lot of documentary films, and I
Yeah,
continued
tell
to
us
do that.
about some of the tell us about some of the ones that people, the Weathermen and the Daniel
Oh my gosh,
Johnsons.
that was a really early one. That was done by Sam Green, and I just worked on his 32 sounds.
Hmm.
Let's see, we did Meet the Patels. I've done the Bill Cunningham documentary. I did the Daniel Johnston documentary. I did the Aretha Franklin one called Amazing Grace. A lot of music ones. The Glenn Campbell one called I'll Be Me.
Did you work with Joe Boyd on that? Joe Boyd on
I
Amazing
know
Grace?
so, but I didn't work with. Oh,
Um,
yes, he was involved in the Aretha Franklin. That's
yeah,
correct.
I'm
Yes,
interviewing him tomorrow right after you. So yeah.
right, right.
But
So yeah,
I just read that today and I never knew that part of his biography. But go ahead.
well, I can tell you more later.
Mhm.
Anyway, so yeah, I mean, a lot of them are documentaries. I did work on Melancholia, the Lars Van Trier film,
Mhm.
which was not a documentary. I have worked on some that are not documentaries, obviously. Um, and so that's,
So
you know,
how did you move then into then you formed another company called Seven Seas Music, which really
yes.
specializes in the curation of what's called world music, I guess, to most people.
Right. And that was a natural extension of what we do at the Rights Workshop,
Right.
where we one client was trying to clear a Jan Tiersen track. Jan Tiersen is a well-known French composer, and it took literally 6 months to clear. And France, doesn't work the whole month of August. And clients can't wait that long. So
Right.
my impetus to starting Seven Seas was essentially to offer a bridge to these independent labels and artists that I knew so well from all over the world to Hollywood. So our first client was Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown,
Hmm.
and we provided music to all their shows. And now we have them in SEAL Team and Ted Lasso and Pachenko and Shogun and I don't know, the Kathy Lee show in the morning, and many other shows that I would have to. Trafficked is one that's on Nat Geo. There's a variety of ones, but the world has gotten to a point where there needs to be authenticity. You cannot have
Right.
a show about Palestine and have Israeli music in it, or vice versa. Or you don't want to have a show about the Congo and put South African music in it. So you have to be very regionally specific and many times language specific. It used to be a few years ago when somebody needed a Russian piece of music. They were like, Brooke, we don't care if it's in Russian or Ukrainian. It didn't make a difference. And
Right.
now it's going to
Oh yeah.
definitely make a
I,
difference.
I think that would make a difference. And again, you've made it the way you've set up the company is, if I remember correctly, it's sort of
Hmm.
an online platform where people can,
Hmm.
filmmakers, be they large or small, can come and audition tracks and then get in touch with you just quickly via the web to
Correct.
get an to get an estimate and to negotiate a fee. So
Hmm.
and how large is the library if you know at this point in time?
Well, I think online we only have about 15,000 tracks, but we really control about 30,000 because we
Hmm.
don't put every single song up. But
Right.
we do get you an answer and a quote in 24 hours
Right.
because we have the ability to license these tracks fully
So
for,
do
through
the
legal compliance for productions.
yeah, do the artists do you agree on a price beforehand, or is it like the offer comes in and then the things negotiated, or
I mean, most artists, and I'm not saying everyone, but they know that we know what those prices should be, and many artists, especially ones we're working with, they'll take any fee because
yeah,
some fees, and also it depends on. We sent some money to a young man who had a piece in Ted Lasso in Nigeria, and I'm sure that amount of money was enough for him to live on for a year.
wow,
Whereas, that same amount of money might pay for someone in New York City's half of their rent for 1 month. So,
yeah,
it's a big difference, which is why we did it, because it does make a difference in the lives of some of these artists in other places.
hmm,
And then if they own the publishing, there's also residuals if it goes on a network TV show like SEAL Team or something like that.
hmm,
So, you know, something, even a German guy, we had something that came through during COVID and only was a few $100. And he said he was thrilled to take it because it would help pay his rent.
wow,
So, artists are not making money through Spotify.
right,
They're not making money through digital downloads either. I mean, there was a recent article in the New York Times about the cost of young people going to shows these days.
right.
How they have to pay $600 to $3,000 to go to a show of a artist like a Lady Gaga or on that level to go see. And I just don't understand how young people can afford that. I mean, I can barely afford that, let
Well,
alone,
what
I
happens
mean,
is,
unless it's something super duper duper special.
oh,
But
well,
I mean, artists are, I
well,
don't know.
well,
That's another conversation,
yeah, but
Sal.
young people can, the one thing is, as horrible as it is, being a musician myself and seeing what comes in from streaming and things, but they do have access to a great great music discovery. It's just a shame that the system is broken. Like my daughter, finds these obscure 60s bands that I never heard of, and I and then I see, and it's like, oh, they made 4 albums in a year and a half. They're all fantastic. Nobody knows who these people are. And, it could be a way to rediscover them, but, just by streaming, they're not going to make anything.
Oh,
Somebody,
I know.
it's the record company is making the money, and it is sort of a tragic situation. And I think there's a real hunger on the part of musicians, obviously, to be involved in your end of the game. It used to,
Yes, because when we do play something, it is a big it's a nice chunk of change.
yeah,
It's not consistent and it's also a crapshoot.
right.
So people can get really excited about wanting to be a part of us, but on the other hand, it's like I could love your music. Like one of my favorite bands that we signed right in the beginning is like a band that sounds like Metallica, but I have yet to be able to place their music.
Yeah,
So, you know.
WWE. I remember when I used to work with a great gentleman who you went to
Yes.
college with, Tom Barreca.
Yeah.
He this is a guy who worked in business development at WW, and I remember they sold a lot of those CDs, and they gave a lot of new metal bands, some money and to fill up.
Exposure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what from a musical standpoint, so is exciting you now, that maybe as a part of your music or maybe outside of your business, musically?
Oh, that's a long conversation. I mean, I love music, obviously. I can't say there's a certain genre that excites me more than another. I am thrilled to know that the world is opening up more to African music because that's been
Mhm.
my passion and love for a very long time. So there are a lot of new bands coming out, and Afropop is now getting some
Mhm.
recognition in the press and with certain artists. And I do like the crossover even of Latino music. I mean, Bad Bunny coming out and singing, it's lovely to see that the world is becoming a smaller place, should I say. But I mean, for me personally, in my work and whatnot, I have a few film projects I would like to work on.
Well, you did
Uh,
mention you recently. Let's talk about the Janisine film you were involved in recently.
yeah,
So tell us a
yeah.
little bit about the genesis
So,
of that.
well, Janacine film was presented to me by a close colleague, friend, childhood friend of mine, who is a film director, Varda Barkar, and she had read this book called Society's Child and was thinking about making it into a film as long as, Janacine was on board. And she'd gotten Janice's approval to do so and asked me about it. And I said I would love to come in and be a producer and help raise the funds for it, as well as music supervise it or handle the music aspect of it. And we did so. I was able to bring in a colleague from high school and with actually a few colleagues from high school who helped contribute to the making of the film financially. And then we got grants and we put it together, and it will be out on American Masters come June of
Mhm.
2025. It's called Janice Ian Breaking Silence.
Mhm.
Um, and there are some theatrical
Is it current?
exhibitions
Is it currently?
currently, and
Is it still?
Janice is at some of them, so it's very exciting.
No. So that something moving forward that you want to do more of the film, or was it
Well,
just
I do.
happenstance?
I enjoy raising funds for projects that I feel like I can contribute. I
You
do
are
have
you are a rare person. I was just talking to someone yesterday, an old client of mine who was from my PR days, who was going up for a job and running something big, and she's like, "Well, fundraising is a part of it." And she goes, "I hate that." So you're rare, but go ahead. You were saying you're good at raising the funds to
Well,
complete
I
things,
mean, I
and you have
don't ask me on everything, but I
yeah.
mean, I do have a project, a series project about world music called Global Divas that I am putting together. Since I'm not a director, I need to find female directors for it.
Mhm.
But I have a list, and we're going to put that together, and then find someone to back that. And then I have another scripted project that is essentially about travels in Africa and
Mm,
during a coup d'etat that happens in Mali in 1991.
mm.
Um, so that's a different thing. But these are, projects that I enjoy doing while I'm doing my regular work. And, but I have some goals and some other things that I'd like to do. I do enjoy working with foundations and
Mhm.
nonprofits as well. That I'm a recent member of the Explorer Club. And so it's exciting to meet people there. They're doing some really good and interesting work.
Are you on your
Um,
way to Antarctica to get some Antarctic music, or
no, but I
companies?
did talk to someone literally yesterday about going to Papua New Guinea. I want to go there and I want to go to Sumatra because I think the music in Sumatra might be kind of fun.
And that's all
Um,
tax deductible, I'd imagine.
on a certain degree,
Well,
yes.
I don't think you're going to have much trouble now. I don't think they're going to be looking at your taxes, or
Oh, maybe not. That would be
no,
nice,
no.
but
That's the one bright side of of what's the travesty that is current day. Anything else you want to add before we go? I mean, it's been great catching up with you again. Hearing
yeah.
about your experiences in the 80s and the 90s in New York, which reminds me of mine. Not as glamorous, but but equally memorable. Are you do get back to New York every once in a while?
I do,
Uh,
and actually would like to spend more time. I love New York. New York
yeah,
is so much fun. There's always something to do there.
right. You have to just dig a little bit now these days. Okay, well, thank you so much, Brooke Wentz. The book is Transfigured New York. For musicians,
Yes.
she has written other books which kind of educate you about the business of music licensing. It was Hey, That's My Music, I think, is one of them. So, as she mentioned, this is one area where musicians, if you're lucky enough and things are serendipity between the content and what you put out, you can make a few bucks and get some good exposure. So thank you, Brooke, and we'll see you when you're in New York.
Welcome. Yeah, thanks, Sal.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Hang on.